He did not see it coming. Nobody did. And that was the worst part. It was a Tuesday morning in June, and London was already burning. Not with fire, but with the kind of thick, breathless heat that settles over a city like a lid pressed down on a pot. The sky was a flat, cloudless white. There was no wind. The air above the tarmac of Horse Guards Parade shimmered faintly, the way it does above a road in the desert. It was not even 9 in the morning, and already the temperature was climbing past levels no one had planned for. His name was Owen Carter. He was 23 years old. Owen stood in a line of men that looked, from a distance, like a red wall. 50 guardsmen, each of them trained to be perfectly, silently still. Each of them dressed in the full ceremonial uniform of the household division, the deep red tunic with its brass buttons, the white belt pulled tight across the chest, the thick dark trousers, the black boots polished to a mirror shine, and on each of their heads the bearskin cap. Black, heavy, tall enough to add nearly 18 inches to a man's height, made from real fur, built for a different century, in a different climate, for a different kind of war. Owen had been awake since 4 in the morning. He had showered in cold water, eaten a light breakfast, gone through his kit with the kind of focused attention that only comes from months of training. His boots had been polished the night before, but he checked them again. The brass on his tunic caught the light in the changing room, and he had straightened it twice before he was satisfied. He was not nervous. Not exactly. What he felt was something closer to a tightly wound readiness, a feeling he had learned to carry in his chest without letting it show on his face. That was the job. Not just standing, not just looking imposing. The job was to feel everything and show nothing. Trooping the color is one of the most watched military ceremonies in the world. It marks the official birthday of the British sovereign, and it has been performed in some form for over 300 years. Thousands of people gather on the streets around Buckingham Palace and along the Mall just to watch. Millions more watch on television. Cameras from news organizations across the globe are positioned on rooftops and scaffolds and press platforms, trained on the parade ground from every angle. Every movement is documented. Every face is caught. Nothing, in those 90 minutes, goes unrecorded. Owen knew all of this. He had known it since his unit was assigned the ceremony 6 months earlier. He had trained for it. He had drilled for it. He had stood in practice formations for hours at a time, learning how to exist inside absolute stillness while his body demanded movement, demanded water, demanded rest. He thought he was ready. At 8:57 in the morning, the parade began. The music started first. The bands moved into position with the kind of mechanical precision that makes civilians catch their breath. The sound was enormous and disciplined at the same time, filling the wide parade ground and bouncing off the stone buildings on either side. Owen felt the bass of the drums in his sternum. He fixed his gaze at a point 45 degrees above the horizon, the exact angle he had been taught. He did not blink more than necessary. He did not move his shoulders. He did not shift his weight from one foot to the other, even though the ground was hard and his knees had already started to ache. Around him, the city was very much alive. He could hear the distant sound of the crowd on the Mall, a low and constant murmur like water moving. He could hear the sharp commands of the officers, carried on the air. He could feel the heat pressing down on his bearskin cap like a hand pushing on the top of his head. He did not think about the heat. He had been trained not to think about the heat. The first 20 minutes passed without incident. Then 30 minutes. Then 40. The ceremony continued with the same precise rhythm it always had. The color was trooped. The regiments marched. The royal carriage moved along the edge of the parade ground, and the crowd roared in a way that Owen could feel in his feet through the tarmac, as if the sound itself had weight. By the 50-minute mark, something had changed inside Owen Carter, though he could not have named it at the time. Later, a military doctor would explain it to him in plain terms. When a person stands completely still for an extended period, especially in high heat, blood begins to pool in the lower legs. The heart has to work harder to push it back up. The body's cooling systems, already working at capacity because of the heavy wool uniform and the insulating weight of the bearskin begin to fall behind. Core temperature rises slowly, silently, without any warning signal the conscious mind can read. The brain, which needs a constant and reliable supply of blood to function, begins to receive slightly less than it requires. The body manages this for a long time, and then it stops managing. Owen did not feel himself go. There was no dramatic moment of decision, no last thought, no warning. One moment he was standing, the next, the ground was coming up at him very fast, and then there was nothing at all. The footage was captured from 3 different angles. In one clip, the camera is positioned at ground level, shooting across the parade ground. The line of guardsmen is visible as a block of red and black, and then, suddenly, one figure in the line drops, not sideways, not slowly, straight down, like a building going into itself during a controlled demolition. The men on either side of him do not move, they do not look down, their faces do not change. They continue to stare forward at the 45-degree angle they have been trained to hold, while Owen Carter lies on the ground between them. In another clip, filmed from a press platform above and to the right, you can see the medical team moving before the dust has even settled. 3 of them, in high-visibility jackets that look wildly out of place among the red tunics, converging on Owen from the edge of the parade ground. They are fast, practiced. This is not the first time they have done this. In a third clip, filmed on a mobile phone by a spectator pressed against the barriers on the mall, the fall itself is not visible, but you can see the reaction of the crowd nearest the barrier, heads turning, a ripple of concern moving through them like a stone dropped in water. The ceremony did not pause. This is not a cold thing, though it can look that way on video. It is, in its own way, a form of respect. The ceremony is not about any one person. It is about the institution, the history, the ritual that has held its shape for centuries. Stopping it for one fallen guardsman would not have honored him. It would have made the moment about him in a way he would not have chosen. The medical team had Owen off the parade ground and behind a barrier within 90 seconds. He was conscious by the time they got him into the shade. His first words, according to the medic who treated him, were not about pain or confusion. They were a question. He wanted to know if his unit was still on parade. The medic told him yes. Owen closed his eyes. He was already thinking about what this meant. Not for his body, which was recovering quickly with water and shade and the simple mercy of lying flat. He was thinking about what it meant for everything else. Within 2 hours of the footage appearing on social media, it had been viewed by over 4 million people. Some of them were worried. Some of them were amused. Some of them recorded reaction videos in which they watched Owen fall and laughed, or gasped, or made jokes about British stubbornness, about the absurdity of making soldiers stand in the sun in fur hats. Some of them argued in the comments about whether the ceremony should be changed, whether the uniforms were an outdated relic, whether the whole thing was worth it. Others simply watched the clip on repeat, the way people do when something has happened too fast for the brain to fully process on the first viewing. Owen Carter did not see any of this. He was in a medical tent behind Horse Guards Parade, lying on a cot, staring at the canvas above him and feeling the particular kind of quiet that comes after something has ended before you expected it to. He was not thinking about the 4 million people. He was thinking about the 44 men who had stayed standing. He had trained for 6 months for this day. He had been awake since 4 in the morning. He had done everything right, and his body had done something wrong, and now there was a version of this day that existed in the world that he had not chosen and could not take back. Outside the tent, the ceremony was ending. He could hear the bands playing. He could hear the crowd. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of the royal carriage moving back along the mall toward the palace. He lay on the cot and listened to all of it and said nothing. He was 23 years old, and he did not yet know that this was not the end of his story. It was, in fact, barely the beginning. The first thing Owen Carter wanted, when he walked back into the barracks that afternoon, was to be invisible. He had spent the last few hours in the care of the medical team at Horse Guards, had been cleared by a doctor who told him his vitals were normal and that what had happened was a textbook case of heat-induced syncope, a medical term for fainting that made it sound far more manageable than it had felt. He was given water, a sports drink, a light meal, and a quiet room to sit in while the world outside continued without him. By midday, he was well enough to stand. By early afternoon, he was well enough to be driven back to Wellington Barracks in a staff vehicle with 2 other soldiers who had been pulled from duties for unrelated reasons. Neither of them said anything about what had happened. Neither of them looked at him in a way that suggested they knew. And Owen, who had spent years learning how to make his face say nothing, said nothing. He carried his bearskin cap in his hands the whole way back. The barracks were quiet in the way that military barracks always are in the early afternoon, a kind of organized stillness broken by distant footsteps and the occasional sound of a door. Owen went to his room, put his cap on the shelf above his bed, and sat on the edge of the mattress. His boots were still perfectly polished. His uniform was still straight. He looked, from the outside, exactly as he had looked at 4 in the morning. He pulled out his phone. The message was from a friend from home. A lad named Gary, who still worked in the hardware shop where Owen had spent 2 summers before enlisting. The message said nothing complicated. It said, "Mate, you're on the internet," and below that, a link. Owen clicked it. He watched himself fall. He watched it 3 times. Not because he enjoyed it, and not because he was looking for something in particular. He watched it 3 times because the brain, when confronted with something it cannot process, often needs to repeat the experience before the reality of it settles. He watched himself standing perfectly still in that long red line. He watched the moment just before, when he was still everything he was supposed to be, and then he watched the drop, the sudden total collapse, the 2 men on either side of him, faces forward, eyes fixed, not moving. He turned the phone face down on the mattress. Outside his window, London continued its afternoon. A pigeon landed on the windowsill and looked at him with mild interest before flying off again. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was watching television. He could hear the thin, distant sound of it coming under the door. He had not cried. He would not cry. That was not something he was consciously deciding. It was simply not something that was going to happen. The way that certain physical facts about a person are not decisions but just facts. What he felt instead was a sensation that sat somewhere between shame and anger and a particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the heat. He felt like something had been taken from him. Not his dignity, exactly, he would come to reject that word later, when he had more distance on it, but something smaller and more personal. A version of himself that he had been building for 6 months. The soldier who stood through trooping the color. The one who came back from parade with his boots still shining. He had been building that version of himself, quietly, without making a big thing of it, and it had lasted exactly 52 minutes before the ground came up and took it away. His corporal knocked on his door at 4:30. His name was Neil Dowd. He was 31, lean, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time in the wind. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway and looked at Owen for a moment. "All right?" Neil said. "Yeah," Owen said. Neil nodded. He looked at the bearskin cap on the shelf. He looked back at Owen. Then he said, "Get your kit sorted. Parade review's at 6. And he left. That was all. No speech. No reassurance. No careful handling of feelings. Just the ordinary fact of the next thing, arriving on schedule, waiting for him to stand up and meet it. Owen stood up and met it. He learned about the others the following morning. There was no formal briefing about it. It came out in the way that most things come out in a barracks. Sideways. In conversation. Over a meal. Another soldier in his unit, a quiet lad named Philip Grant, who had been in the regiment for 4 years, mentioned it while they were cleaning kit. He said it as a matter of fact, the way you'd mention the weather. "You know it happens every couple of years," Philip said. "The heat. Some summers it's 2 or 3 lads in the same ceremony." Owen said nothing, but he listened. "Chap before me, couple of years back," Philip continued. "Lance Corporal. Big fella, fit as anything. Went down on the mall. He's a sergeant now, not the type you'd want to argue with. Owen kept working on his kit. "It's the stillness that gets you," Philip said. "It's not the temperature. Well, it's both. But the stillness is what most people don't understand. You stop moving, the blood stops moving. Doesn't matter how fit you are." There was a pause. "I'm just saying," Philip added, and then he left it there. Owen did not respond, but something shifted, very slightly, in the middle of his chest. The knowledge that other men had been where he was, not as an excuse, not as comfort exactly, but as a fact, settled into him the way facts do when you are not ready to do anything with them yet, but you know you will need them later. The internet, meanwhile, had not moved on. By the morning after the ceremony, Owen's fall had been edited into compilation videos, alongside other moments of royal ceremony drama. A horse startling, a guardsman losing his hat in the wind, various stumbles and mishaps captured over decades of public events. His fall was not the most dramatic in the compilation. It was not even the most recent, but it was the newest, and the internet has a particular appetite for new things. Someone had added slow motion. Someone else had added music. A comedy account had added a sound effect of a cartoon anvil. Owen did not see the anvil version, but his younger brother did, and sent it to him with a string of laughing faces, because his younger brother was 19 and had not yet learned to think before he sent things. Owen read the message. He did not respond. He put his phone in his locker and went to morning drill. The week that followed was the longest of his life, and also the most ordinary. He woke at the same time. He drilled at the same time. He ate in the same mess hall, sat at the same table, performed the same duties he had performed every week for the past 2 years. Nobody in his regiment brought up what had happened on the parade ground, not directly, not in a way that required him to respond. This was not because they did not care. It was because the culture of the household division does not easily accommodate open conversations about personal difficulty. These are men who are trained to project composure. The way they showed care was by treating Owen exactly as they had before, by expecting the same things of him, by including him in the same routines, by not making him feel as though he had been reclassified into something smaller. It was, in its way, a kindness. He would only understand that later. What was harder was the phone. Every few days, a new message from someone back home. Not cruel, most of them. Just clumsy. "Mate, saw you online. You all right? You've gone viral, bruv. Think you're a meme now." The messages meant nothing by themselves, but each one was a small reminder that the version of him on the internet was not going away, that somewhere out there, in the infinite recycling of social media, he was going to keep falling, over and over, on an endless loop, for people who did not know his name. He thought about this during the longer, quiet hours. Not obsessively, he was not that kind of person, but he thought about it the way you think about a sound you cannot place. Not loudly, but with a persistent, low-level attention. There was a nurse at the St. James's Palace medical station whose name was Carol Webb. She was 54, gray-haired, practical to the point of being almost blunt. She had worked on the ceremonial medical circuit for 19 years. Owen was referred to her for a follow-up appointment 10 days after the ceremony. He sat across from her in a small, well-lit room and answered her questions. Had he been eating properly? Was he sleeping? Had he experienced any dizziness since the incident? Standard questions. He answered them with the same flat precision he used for everything. Then Carol Webb looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "How many guardsmen do you think I've seen faint in this job?" Owen said he didn't know. 41, she said, "give or take, some summers more than others. Last really hot June, we had 4 in one ceremony." She put his file down on the desk. "It is the most common medical event on the ceremonial circuit, more common than sprains, more common than cuts from kit." She paused. "You are one of 41 people who have sat in that chair." Owen looked at the chair. "Most of them," Carol said, "went on to have completely normal careers. One of them is now a lieutenant colonel." He did not say anything, but something in the architecture of how he had been carrying himself for the past 10 days shifted, very quietly, a fraction of a degree. Not relief, not resolution, something smaller than that. The faint beginning of a different way of holding the story. He walked out of Carol Webb's office into a bright London afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, watching a bus go by. He did not know yet what he was going to do. He did not know whether he would ask to be put on the ceremonial roster again. He did not know whether the image of himself falling was going to stay in the front of his mind or slowly move to the back of it. He knew one thing: he was still in the regiment. His boots were still in his locker. His bearskin cap was still on the shelf above his bed, exactly where he had put it the afternoon he came home. He had not moved it. He had not asked anyone to move it. That, for now, was the only answer he had, and it was enough to carry him through the next morning. To understand what Owen Carter was carrying, you had to go back further than the parade ground. You had to go back to a town called Stoke, where the terraced houses all looked the same, and the high street had been quietly emptying for 20 years. You had to go back to a boy who was not unhappy exactly, but who had a very clear sense that the shape of life in front of him was already drawn, and that it was a shape he did not want. His father, a man named Peter Carter, worked for a logistics company. He had worked there for 26 years. He was a decent, careful man who had done what was expected of him and had found something like contentment in the doing of it. His mother, Linda, worked part-time at a school canteen. She was warm, practical, and deeply proud of her children in the undemonstrative way of women who show love through action rather than words. Owen had a younger brother, Callum, who was 4 years behind him and interested mainly in football and video games and avoiding any situation that required effort. Owen was not like any of them, which was not a criticism of any of them. He was the kind of person who needed a structure larger than the one available to him. He needed a framework with real weight and consequence. He needed to be tested in a way that felt like it mattered. He enlisted at 18. The Army did not romanticize itself for him. The recruiting process was practical, almost clinical. There were aptitude tests and medical checks, and an interview that felt more like a form-filling exercise than a conversation. He was assessed, categorized, and directed toward infantry training. He was not asked how he felt about any of it. He did not need to be asked. Basic training was the hardest thing he had ever done, and also the most clarifying. Not because it was brutal, it was demanding, deeply physical, and relentlessly structured, but it was not cruel. What it was, more than anything else, was honest. If you could do the thing, you could do the thing. If you could not, you could not. There was no ambiguity. There was no office politics, no guessing at what someone else wanted from you. There was the standard, and you either met it or you went back and tried again until you did. Owen met it. He was not the fastest in his intake. He was not the strongest. What he was, his training corporal observed during an assessment review that Owen was not supposed to hear, was the most consistently reliable, the one least likely to give up quietly when no one was looking. That observation followed him through his career in ways he never knew about. When the opportunity to be selected for the household division came up 18 months into his service, Owen put his name forward without telling anyone at home. He did not tell his father, or his mother, or his brother. He did not tell his friends from school, most of whom he had quietly drifted away from. He did not want the conversation about what it meant, or whether it was sensible, or whether he had really thought it through. He just wanted to know if he could do it. The selection process for the household division is not widely discussed outside military circles. It is not a special forces selection. It is not designed to break people, but it is rigorous in a specific and demanding way because the job it selects for demands a specific and demanding kind of person. You need the physical fitness of a serious athlete. You need the mental discipline to perform under observation for extended periods without any variation in your behavior. You need to be able to endure discomfort without complaint, to follow procedure with absolute fidelity, and to project, at all times and under all conditions, an image of total control. Owen passed. He did not celebrate. He went back to his room and ate his dinner and went to sleep. He had been in the household division for 2 years before trooping the color. In those 2 years, he had learned things about the bearskin cap that most people would find surprising. He had learned that it weighed approximately 1.5 pounds when dry, more when wet. He had learned that the interior traps heat with remarkable efficiency, raising the temperature around the skull by several degrees above ambient within minutes of being worn. He had learned that it adds significant height to the wearer's silhouette, but also adds significant biomechanical load to the neck and upper spine, particularly during long-standing periods. He had learned to wear it as though he had been born with it on his head. He had stood in dozens of ceremonial duties by the time Trooping the Color came around. He had done the changing of the guard countless times, standing at the gates of Buckingham Palace while tourists took photographs of themselves standing next to him. He had stood in formation during state visits. He had formed part of the lining of the route during a royal procession. Each duty had its particular demands, its particular pressures, its particular small tests of the discipline he had spent years building. He had never fallen. This, he would later come to understand, was both a credit to his preparation and a source of false confidence. He had passed every test he had been given, and the passage of each test had made the next one feel more manageable. By the time Trooping the Color arrived, the idea that his body might simply refuse to cooperate was not something he had seriously entertained. He had done the work. The work was supposed to hold. What he had not fully reckoned with was the gap between what training prepares you for and what the body simply is. Training builds capacity, it builds endurance and focus and the ability to manage discomfort. But there are physical thresholds that discipline cannot move. When the core temperature rises past a certain point, when the blood pressure in the standing leg drops past a certain point, when the brain receives less than it needs to sustain consciousness, these are not failures of will, they are physiological events. They happen to athletes at peak fitness. They happen to soldiers with 2 years of spotless ceremonial service. They happened to Owen Carter at the 52-minute mark of Trooping the Color, and they would have happened to him whether he had prepared for 6 months or 6 years. He did not know this yet. What he knew, in the days and weeks after the ceremony, was something simpler and more difficult. He knew that he had fallen. He knew that the world had seen it. He knew that the men beside him had not fallen. He knew that the ceremony had continued without him. He knew that somewhere on the internet, a version of him was still falling, on an endless loop, in slow motion, with a cartoon sound effect attached to it. He ran every morning, 6 miles, before the rest of the barracks stirred, not because he was ordered to, not because he was trying to prove something, or punish himself, or burn off anything. He ran because running was the thing he had always been able to rely on, the physical act that most closely matched his interior state. Forward motion, sustained effort, the road giving way under his feet in a rhythm that did not need thought. He ran along the embankment mostly. The Thames in the early morning was a different thing from the Thames the tourists photographed at midday. At 5:30, it was gray-green and quiet, moving with a lazy power that had nothing to do with the city around it. He ran beside it and let his mind go wherever it needed to go. Some mornings it went to the parade ground. He played the moment back the way he had on his phone the first night, not the fall itself, which he had no memory of, but the 52 minutes before it, the music, the heat, the fixed point above the horizon, the way his knees had begun to ache. He tried to find the moment where something could have been different, the decision point, the thing he had missed. He never found it, because there was no decision point, because his body had not asked him. Other mornings he thought about Neil Dowd, his corporal, standing in the doorway and saying, "Get your kit sorted." He thought about Philip Grant telling him about the lance corporal who was now a sergeant. He thought about Carol Webb and her 41. He thought slowly and without reaching any conclusions about what it meant to be defined by a moment that lasted less than a second, about whether the 52 minutes of standing mattered less than the 1 second of falling, about whether the 4 million people who had watched the clip had also watched the 52 minutes, and of course they hadn't, and of course that wasn't fair, and of course fairness was not something the situation owed him. He thought about his father, who had worked in the same logistics company for 26 years, never once making the front page of anything, never going viral, never being the subject of a comment section debate. His father, who got up every morning and did his job and came home and did it again. He had spent years wanting something different from that, something bigger, more visible, more shaped by his own choices. And now the most visible moment of his career so far was one he hadn't chosen at all, one that had happened to him while he was trying to do everything right. The river moved beside him. He ran. And slowly, over weeks, something that was not resolution but was close to it began to form in the back of his mind. Not a decision, not yet, more like a direction. More like the faint awareness that there was something on the other side of this, if he was willing to keep walking toward it. His bearskin cap was still on the shelf above his bed. He had not moved it. Every morning, when he woke up, it was the first thing he saw. The regimental sergeant major's name was Graham Ellis. He was 50 years old, had served for 31 of them, and had the kind of face that had seen so much that it had stopped reacting to most things. He was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had spent 3 decades in an institution that rewarded precision and steadiness above almost all other qualities, and he had become, over time, a near-perfect expression of that institution. He called Owen into his office on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the ceremony. It was not a disciplinary meeting. The paperwork made that clear, and the tone of Graham Ellis's voice when he'd told Owen to come and see him after morning parade had been, by the exacting standards of regimental communication, almost gentle. Owen sat across the desk from him. The office was small, neat, and functional. There was a photograph of the regiment on the wall. There was a coffee mug that said nothing on it. Graham Ellis looked at Owen for a moment, in the way that career soldiers look at younger soldiers when they are deciding how much of a thing to say. "You've been running," Graham said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Owen said. "Noticed you're out before first light most days." "Yes, sir." Graham Ellis looked at the desk. He moved a pen an inch to the left, and then left it there. "The roster for next month's state visit has an opening," he said. "Ceremonial lining duty, mall and forecourt, standard full kit." Owen said nothing. "I'm not putting your name on it without asking you first," Graham said. "That's not standard procedure. I want you to know that. Normally I'd just assign it." Owen understood what was being offered. Not charity, not a second chance in the dramatic, movie poster sense. Something more practical than that. An opening in the roster. A question about whether he wanted to fill it. "Put my name on it," Owen said. Graham Ellis nodded once. He moved the pen back to where it had been. "Dismissed." Owen stood. He turned toward the door. "Carter," Graham said. Owen turned back. The heat was 42 degrees on the parade surface that day. Graham Ellis said it without looking up from his desk. "I've had men pass out from 40 in training, with full water access." He still did not look up. "Dismissed," he said again. Owen went back to his room and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the bearskin cap on the shelf. He reached up and took it down. He turned it over in his hands the way you turn over a thing that has been sitting in a particular place for so long that you've stopped actually seeing it. The weight of it was the same. The smell of it was the same. A faint combination of leather and treated fur and the particular institutional scent that clings to all military equipment. The height of it, the solid blankness of it, the way it sat in his hands like something that had not decided yet whether it was ordinary or significant. He put it back on the shelf. Then he got up, laced his boots, and went to afternoon drill. The weeks between that conversation and the state visit were not easy, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, even to himself. There were mornings when the run along the embankment felt mechanical rather than grounding. There were evenings when the barracks felt very quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with the noise level. There were moments, standing in practice formation during drill, when the memory of the parade ground tried to surface. Not the fall itself, but the moment just before, when he had been standing and everything had been fine, and he had not known that everything was about to not be fine. He learned to let those moments come, and then let them pass. Not because he was especially good at it, because there was no alternative that made any sense. He called his mother on a Sunday night, 3 weeks before the state visit. Linda Carter answered on the second ring, as she always did, and asked if he had been eating properly, and whether the weather was as warm down in London as it was in Stoke. He said yes and yes. She did not mention the parade. He did not mention the parade. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing particularly important, and when he put the phone down he felt steadied in a way he could not have explained. She had not said anything useful. She had not given him advice or encouragement or a framework for processing what had happened to him. She had simply been there, ordinary and warm, the way she had always been there, and the ordinariness of her was, in that moment, exactly what he needed. His younger brother Callum called 2 days later and asked if he was getting fan mail from the fall. Owen told him to get lost, which was the most affectionate thing they knew how to say to each other. A week before the state visit, his unit went through a full practice run of the ceremonial duties, full kit, bearskin caps, the works. Owen stood in the line and held the position and fixed his gaze and felt his knees begin their familiar ache at the 30-minute mark. He kept standing. At the end of the practice, Philip Grant walked past him without breaking stride and said, "Good drill," in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man who has said those 2 words to a lot of people over a lot of years. Owen nodded. He had not needed anything more than that. The state visit itself was on a cold Tuesday in October, the kind of London autumn day where the sky is the color of old pewter and the air has a bite to it that wakes you up more thoroughly than coffee. The heat, that specific and particular enemy, was not a factor. The temperature on the Mall was 8 degrees. Owen stood in his position in full ceremonial kit and felt the cold working its way through the wool tunic, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he was grateful for it. He stood for 90 minutes. He did not fall. There was no crowd of 4 million watching. The cameras were trained on the foreign dignitaries and the royal family, not on the lines of guardsmen flanking the route. When the carriage passed, Owen looked at the point above the horizon and did not blink more than necessary and did not shift his weight. When it was over, his unit marched back to barracks and dismissed. Owen took off his bearskin cap and carried it in his hands the same way he had carried it in the staff vehicle back from Horse Guards in June. He walked down the corridor to his room, put the cap on the shelf above his bed, and sat down. He did not feel triumphant. There was nothing to feel triumphant about. He had done his job. He had stood where he was supposed to stand. The thing he had been afraid of had not happened. That was all. That was enough. He pulled out his phone, opened his messages, and typed a reply to his brother Callum that said simply, "State visit today. All fine." Callum replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Owen put the phone down and looked out the window at the gray October afternoon. A bus went by, a woman with a pushchair, 2 teenagers eating chips from a paper bag. He had been a royal guard for 2 years and 4 months. He had fallen, publicly and completely, in front of the world. He had stayed in the regiment. He had done the next thing, and the next thing after that, and the next thing after that, and now he was sitting in his room on a cold Tuesday in October, and the day was ordinary and he was in it, fully and quietly, without anything dramatic to show for the 6 months that had passed since June. He was 23 years old. He was still there, and the bearskin cap was still on the shelf. It was not on the news when it happened. There were no cameras. The moment would not go viral. Nobody in the crowd outside the palace was filming for any particular reason, and the press positions that June morning were trained, as they always are, on the royal family, on the carriages, on the color being trooped through the formations. Nobody was looking for Owen Carter, which was exactly how he needed it. The second trooping the color arrived the way these things arrive, when you have been waiting for them for a long time, both slowly and all at once. One morning it was 11 months away, and the next morning it was 4 weeks, and then it was 1 week, and then it was the Tuesday before, and Owen was sitting on his bed at 8:30 in the evening, doing the thing he had done the year before, checking his kit, examining his boots, straightening the brass on his tunic by the light of the overhead bulb. His hands were steady. He was not conscious of them being steady. He only noticed it when he set the tunic down and looked at his fingers and realized there was nothing to notice. He had asked to be put on the roster for trooping the color. He had asked Graham Ellis in the same measured way he had accepted the state visit 6 months earlier, not as a statement or a declaration, just as a practical request. His name had gone on the list. No one had made a ceremony of it. There was a younger soldier in the regiment named Aaron Hewitt, 19 years old, from somewhere outside Norwich, in his first year of ceremonial duties. He had been assigned a position in the same company as Owen for the trooping. The night before the ceremony, Aaron knocked on Owen's door and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who has something to say and is unsure whether saying it is allowed. "Can I ask you something?" Aaron said. "Go on," said Owen. Aaron looked at his boots for a moment. "Is it, the standing, for the full ceremony, what's it actually like?" Owen thought about this. He thought about how to answer it honestly, without giving the boy something he didn't need. "It's hard," Owen said. "Your legs will ache. The heat will be worse than you expect, even if you've trained for it. Your mind will try to give you things to think about, and you have to let them go by without grabbing onto them." He paused. "The music helps. Once you've found your point on the horizon, lock onto it, and don't negotiate with yourself about it." Aaron nodded. "And if something happens," Owen said, "and you're still standing at the end, that's the job done. And if something happens and you're not—" He paused for a moment, choosing the next words with the same care he used when polishing the brass on his tunic. "The regiment is still there when you wake up." Aaron nodded again, more slowly this time. He said, "Right, thanks." And he went back to his room. Owen sat on his bed. He thought about what he had said, about the regiment still being there. He had not planned to say it. It had come out the way true things sometimes do, not from thought, but from somewhere closer to the bone. The regiment had been there. That was the fact he kept returning to, when he turned the year over in his mind. Not the fall, not the 4 million viewers, not the cartoon sound effect his brother had sent him. The regiment had been there. Neil Dowd in the doorway, with his 2 words. Philip Grant and his matter-of-fact Lance Corporal story. Graham Ellis and his pen and his 42 degrees. Carol Webb and her 41. The institution had not flinched. It had simply kept going, and it had expected him to keep going with it, and he had, and that was the whole of it. He went to sleep at 10 o'clock. He woke at 4. The morning of the second trooping the color was different from the first, in the way that second attempts are always different. Not because the circumstances have changed, but because the person inside them has. The same London, the same Horse Guards parade, the same distance from the barracks to the parade ground, the same tarmac, the same formations taking shape in the early morning light, the same sounds of kit being adjusted and boots finding their positions on the marked ground. But Owen moved through it differently, not with less care, with more, in a way, but a quieter more. He checked his kit without anxiety. He took his position in the formation with the ease of a man who knows the ground under his feet. He found his point above the horizon, 45 degrees, and fixed on it, and the world arranged itself around that point the way it always did. The heat, when it came as expected. By the first hour it was serious. The temperature was already into the high 20s and climbing. Owen could feel the weight of the bearskin cap pressing on the crown of his head, could feel the heat building beneath it the way it always did, that particular, insistent warmth that has no direction, that simply accumulates. He could feel his legs settling into the long, patient ache of extended stillness. He breathed slowly. He kept his gaze on the point. He thought about nothing and let everything pass through him. There was a moment, sometime in the second hour, when his vision swam slightly at the edges. He registered it without responding to it. He shifted his breathing, very slightly. He thought about the river in the early morning, the gray-green water moving, the road giving way under his feet. He thought about his mother answering on the second ring. He thought about Aaron Hewitt in his room the night before, with his boots and his question. The moment passed. The ceremony continued around him with the relentless, ancient precision of something that has survived for centuries and will survive for centuries more. The bands played. The color was trooped through the formations in the sequence that has not changed in a very long time. The royal carriage moved in its appointed arc. The crowd on the mall gave out its wave of sound. And Owen Carter stood. He stood in the heat and the noise and the history of it, in the full weight of the uniform and the full weight of what the past year had been, and he did not move, and he did not fall. He stood at the 1 hour mark, at the 1 hour 15 mark, at the point where the ceremony began its final movements, and the crowd's energy lifted into something that even the strictest ceremonial discipline cannot entirely keep out. He stood through all of it. When the dismissal came, it came as a sound and then a movement, the company's breaking, the precise dissolution of the formations that had been so exactly constructed for the last 90 minutes. Owen brought his arms to his sides. He stood for one more breath. Then he stepped out of position and became, again, simply a man standing on a parade ground. He removed his bearskin cap. The air on his head was almost cold in comparison. He held the cap at his side and stood for a moment in the dispersing crowd of guardsmen, the sound of the ceremony fading around him, the city reasserting itself at the edges, the distant horns of traffic, the sound of the crowd on the mall beginning to break up, a siren somewhere far to the north. Aaron Hewitt appeared at his elbow. The young soldier's face was flushed and damp, and his eyes had the slightly glassy look of someone who has just held himself together for longer than he thought he could. "Good drill," Owen said. Aaron let out a breath. "Thought I was going to go about 45 minutes in," he said quietly. "I know," Owen said. They walked back toward the barracks without saying anything else. No one clapped. No one made a speech. No camera was trained on the moment Owen Carter walked back through the gates of Wellington Barracks and went up to his room and put his bearskin cap on the shelf above his bed. It sat there in exactly the same place it had always sat. He changed out of his ceremonial kit and put on his ordinary uniform and went down to the mess hall for lunch. He ate with Philip Grant and 2 other men from his company, and they talked about football and about a television show one of them had been watching, and about the possibility of rain that weekend. Nobody mentioned the ceremony. Nobody mentioned last year. Owen ate his meal. He thought about his father, Peter Carter, who had gone to the same logistics company for 26 years without any of it ever making the front page of anything. He thought about the particular kind of strength in that, the strength that does not require an audience, the strength that is made entirely of the next day, and the next day, and the next day after that. He had wanted, at 18, to be tested in a way that mattered. He had gotten his wish, just not in the shape he had imagined. The test had not been trooping the color. The test had not been standing for 90 minutes in 42-degree heat. The test had been everything after, the 6 months of mornings, the runs along the river, the parade practice in full kit, the question from Aaron Hewitt the night before, the moment in the second hour when his vision had swum and he had decided, without drama and without anyone watching, to keep breathing slowly and let it pass. That had been the test. He had passed it every morning for a year, invisibly, on a schedule that no one would ever make a video about. Later that afternoon, his phone rang. It was Callum. Owen answered it standing by the window of his room, looking out at the October light that had become June again without him quite noticing the transition. "You were on today, weren't you?" Callum said. "Yeah," Owen said. "How'd it go?" "Fine," Owen said. "All fine." There was a pause. Callum said, "Mum was watching on the telly. She said she spotted you." Owen looked out the window. "She couldn't have. We all look the same." "That's what I told her," Callum said. "She said she knew anyway." Owen smiled. Not a big smile. The kind that happens before the person knows it's happening. "Tell her I'll call Sunday," he said. He hung up. He stood at the window for another minute. The street below was ordinary. A man walking a dog, a woman with a shopping bag, a child on a scooter, wobbling slightly, finding her balance. He turned from the window. The bearskin cap was on the shelf. Right where it belonged, right where it had always been, even in the months when looking at it had been the first difficult thing he did every morning. He picked up his kit bag and went to evening duties. He was 24 years old now. He had work to do.